thank you so much for your presentations and talks. Also to share these ideas, how the story behind queer British art or Ars Homoerotica. And actually I would like to start with you, Clare. Pavel talked a lot about this, a director who made it possible at that time to do such an exhibition at the National Museum in Warsaw. So queer British art, it was a suggestion by you as a curator, or it was a commissioned exhibition, or it was the director who said, well, let's think of doing something like queer British art?
It was a combination of different things. So Tate had a fairly newly formed LGBT staff network, and someone in the network had spotted that 2017, this 50th anniversary was coming up. And so they had said to the director, can we do something? And at the same time, I was being interviewed for a job actually to do with the 18th century part of the collection. But I was talking about LGBT programming and about my research into history of the body and sexuality. And so I was told, what do you want, if this is a thing, do you want to do a thing? But at the time, the expectation was it would be very small, that it would be maybe a small display, maybe one room, maybe a display case. And I thought about it, and I slept on it, and I said to them, I'll do it, but if we do it, it has to be enormous. It can't be a small thing. It's never been done before, and to throw that away on a kind of one-room display felt like that would be a missed opportunity. And so I sort of started with the smallest budget that had ever been given to an exhibition, and I kind of worked my way up and, claimed more and more space and claimed more and more bits until it became a really big thing. And that was partly due to both directors, Penelope Curtis initially, and then Alex Farquharson when he came in. Alex Farquharson in particular really got behind the show and really saw its potential. But I was also helped a lot by a piece of market research that we'd had, which said that audiences found Tate Britain very confusing, very alienating. Someone said that if it was at a party, it would be an accountant standing by itself in a corner. So I slightly used that to say, this is a way that we could make our collection feel a bit more interesting.
I would also like to know about this title, Queer British Art. There is this ambivalence. Queer is about this critique of a fixed identity, and then you come in with British, and label it on a national level, and give it this branding. Yep. So tell us about your ambivalence with the title.
So I really liked that tension between the kind of openness of queer and then the sense that, but it's still here, and that the specificity of tying it to the sort of national story. I was also very inspired in using the word queer by Derek Jarman, the great cinematographer and also artist. He said of queer, the word queer used to frighten me, but now I see queer as liberation. And we had that quote outside the front of the exhibition, and I think it captures very much something of the journey that we were telling. This journey from a period when any sort of identity label could be frightening, through to a period when we could embrace the full, multifaceted nature of who we are. It was also important to me from a kind of rigor point of view. I didn't want to put any identity labels on people that they themselves wouldn't have recognized. And I think one of the nice things about queer is that it's very fluid. It can be in the eye of the beholder. It can be in the life of a person. It was one of the identity labels that was relevant at the time of the show. But it was very open-ended. And I've been really pleased that afterwards, although at the time everyone was asking me about why I'd called the show Queer British Art and was it okay to use the word queer now. I had to answer questions about that in every single interview I did. But now I've seen like small regional museums having a display called like queer art or queer life, and that's really pleasing.
Especially the reference to Derek German is very brilliant because he actually had a series of paintings entitled Queer, right?
Yeah, and it was just kind of, he was like, it felt like he was almost like the godfather of the show, that, you know, I liked to have that connection.
Who was the mother?
Probably Michael Field. But yeah, I mean, it was just nice having that kind of spirit coming through the show.
Yes, but I want to stick more also on this issue of this national identity that you were also talking about, Pavel, to brand it with this British, because would be queer art in Britain, but then you labeled it with this queer British art, and this means also this taking into consideration this who is included, who is excluded. Yeah. And did you get a lot of critique also for this?
I got some criticism. I think some people, I mean, it was more kind of before the show went up. Many people thought that, you know, when I said I do a show on queer British art, they were like, well, there isn't any. And there was this sense that the national artistic canon could not be explored in this way. Although, actually, I think it was more kind of people hadn't really thought about it and they were actively hostile to it. I didn't face the kind of criticism that you faced in terms of from the politicians and so on. I mean, fortunately, we didn't have the same context for it. Yeah.
I think that the contextual aspect is fascinating here, and you can place yourself here in Austria in your own context, which will be slightly different as well. Because you have two countries with a completely different attitude towards kind of divergent and pluralistic sexuality. And in case of Britain, you have the situation where, to some extent, I think, it was even more difficult than in Poland. And that is why the exhibition happened in 2017 and in Poland in 2010. Because in Poland, at least, people understood that this is a topical cultural issue, which is part of our new democracy. All relatively liberal or left-wing intellectuals, and the far-righters as well, understood that this is a subject that we really struggle with. This is the bone of our cultural wars. So that is why it is relevant, and some people wanted it, and some people would rather kill all of us not to have it in the National Museum. But in British, because I work in Britain academia, when the exhibition was in preparation, this was this very pernicious attitude that Kate mentioned, Clare, that we don't need it anymore. They have never had exhibition of this type on such a major scale, but we don't need it anymore. It's something from the 70s. It's something from so that is not fashionable anymore. It's too cool for school.
Yeah.
Kind of attitude that they represented. So at least in Poland, they knew that that's important. And to some extent, you mentioned that you had to struggle with the importance of the subject.
Yeah, and I think kind of connected to that, it was kind of, lots of academics were quite sort of skeptical about the idea that, some people in queer studies were incredibly supportive of it and incredibly generous of their time and energy, but other people were quite suspicious of it and felt that I was going to be, I don't know, doing something that would be kind of not radical enough or not. I think I got it in the neck from lots of different angles. For some people it was too radical, for some people it wasn't radical enough. Some people complained that I wasn't a gay man curating it. Some people felt that having a lesbian curating a major show about queer art was an odd thing to be doing. Some people felt that it was too conservative. It was interesting too, the British art context, but I think a lot of people, when they hear the word queer art, the thing that comes to their mind is Maplethorpe. And so a lot of people were expecting the show to be full of like Andy Warhols and Mapplethorpes. And I think foregrounding the British in that way was quite sort of tricksy for some of the audience. But yeah, it was interesting.
In my case, they wanted Michelangelo or something like this.
Everyone wants Michelangelo.
You have the Michelangelo in London. We have Leonardo da Vinci in Krakow. Exactly, this is what they wanted. But I knew that Piotr Piotrowski is not going to last in the museum for a long time. I knew that his idea of critical museum is too radical, that he would be rejected. The board initially, but was enthusiastic. The curatorial staff, they hated the concept and they didn't like the exhibition at all. They were conservative. And because basically all the yearly money, public money, were sunk into the exhibition, because otherwise the exhibition wouldn't be possible because no one wanted to give money to it, it also destroyed the finance of the museum. And yeah, and I knew that he's not going to last for a very long time, and I knew that I have to do the exhibition fast. I can't wait for 3 years or 5 years for a loan from the Vatican or from Louvre. It would be too complicated. So I knew that I had to do it fast, and this was one, and efficiently. This is how the concept of querying the collection came to my mind. That I can do it on the basis of the vast collection, which are wonderful as a queer visual archive in every country. And it will be faster.
Pavel, because Claire was talking about this, that this exhibition was a product also of a lot of talks, or this influenced the exhibition, that you were working with the community. And in Warsaw, so the community was backing you up. The queer community was backing you up at the exhibition? They were of
the queer community has had nothing to do with the exhibition at the conception level. Of course, when the exhibition opened, we organized a series of talks and discussion and debates and lectures, and the opening was very popular. And completely serendipitously, the same year, 2010, a Europride was organized in Warsaw. So it was like many international visitors, and everyone thought that we organized the exhibition for Europride. But no, we didn't know a year in advance that the Europride would be. So it was a completely serendipitously. It was a miracle. So we've got a lot of this type of audience as well, international queer audience. So queer community was involved as participants, but at the conception level, it was a purely academic concept of making the National Museum critical. And what is the current burning issue? LGBTQ rights. And then I have been doing queer exhibitions in Poland since the early 90s. So I had this experience, not only me, other people as well, but as a curator and academic, I had an experience of organizing contemporary exhibition of this type. So that is why I was invited by Piotrowski. It's one of the main reasons. And it was based on academic research, my academic research and his concept. And then the community got involved. But when you were talking about your show, I was thinking that maybe it was one of the mistakes. I always think about mistakes to learn from them, that maybe we should involve more queer community before in Warsaw, not a month before it opened, but at the level of conception. But we were so busy with the attacks on the exhibition and with the constant pernicious media attention and the debates in the parliament, that it just became a huge issue that were debated by the press. Anyway, but yes, in terms of talks, we had a lot, but queer community as a community, not artists or academics, had nothing to do with the conception of the exhibition in the Polish case.
It's the one thing that nobody tells you when you set out to curate a queer exhibition, is that it will be an exhausting and isolating experience. And it doesn't really matter whether you are fighting rows in the press or rows in the parliament or internal debates in your institution. There are moments when it's really hard, because if you are out as somebody who is lesbian or gay or bisexual or trans or any of the identity labels, people start reading your work through the light of your own identity, and some people will judge you for it in a range of different ways. In fact, one person used to always introduce me at conferences as, "This is Clare Barlow, who has now ruined her future career." And it was a joke, but it wasn't completely a joke. Lots of people, I think, it's a really weird experience professionally, particularly if you're coming from the world of historic art, which, let's face it, most people do not get particularly worked up about or write angry letters to the Daily Mail about, to suddenly find yourself at the forefront of some of these cultural wars.
Well, in my case, I left Poland to enter exhibition in 2010 after the exhibitions.
You basically set fire to things and ran away.
I left Poland and Piotr Piotrowski resigned. Yeah.
And now you are back in Poland? And
I am back in Poland for a personal reason, but he resigned from the directorship because it was he was too contentious as a figure of a director. But because of this short moment and a vision of one person actually, and the power of someone who is a director of the institution, because they do have a lot of power, which is slightly undemocratic, that they have such power. So through to the power of this one person, it was possible to queer the entire collection of the National Museum in Poland. And that is why I always say that there is hope. Because if it happened in Poland, if it happened in Tate Modern, which is also difficult on a different level, when it happens, so it is possible to happen everywhere. And of course, there is one institution that is just screaming, burning, and asking to be queer, because it is going to change the entire history of our Western culture. It is the Vatican. Because this is where all the major masterpieces are. And it shows the power.
Maybe that's where we should go next, Pavel.
And this is a power of the museums, actually, the enormous power of the museums that imagine queering the collection of the Vatican would change the history of Catholicism.
Eyes on the prize.
I have to, before I lose my voice, I would like to bring the audience in. If you have comments or questions, please feel free.
I think, isn't every storeroom of every European museum full of never shown works? Yeah. I think you could do every show in a clandestine way, like a queer show, probably.
Yes, I mean, I think it's extraordinary, some of the things that museums have in store, and this was certainly my experience with Tate. It was a real pleasure for this show to have the opportunity to conserve some works that hadn't been shown in the gallery for 70 or 80 years, including some amazing female nudes painted by women artists.
Well, I considered every museum, especially encyclopedic museums, as I mentioned, because of the vast history that they cover, a treasury of queer art, when you can find many treasures. In my case, it was the academic male nudes, for example. But you have to be very free and not oppressed by kind of official discourses to discover it like this. Because from the conventional art historical point of view, a curatorial point of view, it was an outrage to take this very specific genre that played only educational function for artists and suddenly put them on a display or in a queer way. But this is the queerest example of kind of the treasury of Western, at least, art, that all male were trained for years to look and to render the male body, real male body, usually working class men in Europe or Italians. And then to put on the scheme of the real male bodies the homoerotic tradition of antiquity, because the drawings, they were a combo of a real body or ancient models. And I don't know if this is my question. Have you ever had an extensive exhibition of the academic male nudes, which are in the Austrian, for example, museums?
Because we had The Naked Man.
Yeah.
This
exhibition. That's true.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we also really wanted to sort of get across, I keep saying we, I always say we when I talk about the exhibition, as if it was an army of me all doing the show together, but it was just me. But one of the things that I really wanted to get across is that this idea that queerness can be in the eye of a beholder. I really wanted to affirm our audience into the idea that you can walk into your own local museum, wherever that is, and stand in front of a painting and say, well, it looks queer to me, and feel affirmed that that is a totally acceptable reading, and it's totally legitimate, and it has an art history, and it has a history that, you know, Graham Robertson in the late 19th century is doing that with Walter Crane. That these sorts of ways of looking are also important, and that we should all feel affirmed in what we get out of the objects, as well as the sort of how these objects are created and the context through which they're made.
Hi. I'm not sure if I'm going to phrase this correctly, and don't take it the wrong way, because I think the presentations were so great, and it was really good to see that sort of representation. But I'm struggling to figure out how we can queer the museum and queer art spaces in a way that isn't, sorry, please don't take my photo, I'm not out. So in a way that isn't cis-sexist and accidentally erases trans individuals. Because when we say things like the male body, and then we only have images of a cisgender male body, you're erasing trans people. And when we say the female body, and we are only talking about a cisgender woman, then it erases the trans female, or it says that she's not really female. And so even at moments throughout this event, I have felt like, oh, there are people who are being erased right now. And I struggled personally with it because I was trying to figure out, okay, what word do I use instead? And I don't know how to refer to the historical female nude because what do we call it instead? And how do we queer the museum in a way that welcomes and embraces the fact that there really isn't a single image of what a female nude or a male nude looks like?
Maybe, may I start? I'm talking about the male nude as a discovery that was held in the storages of museums. But I had an entire section of the exhibition which was about transgender. I didn't pick up any object from this section because I had time limitation. But there was a big section on contemporary transgender art from Central and Eastern Europe and some pieces from the collection of the museum with some major discovery. For example, it is kind of part of the former Habsburg Empire. So in Hungary, the most important probably Central Eastern European transgender artist in the 20th century is El Kazowski, an artist from Hungary. That was transgender, she was transgender, he was transgender. And I had this in my exhibition. It was a discovery that I've made. But you asked a question, which is a very good question when it comes to exhibition. I think that it dealt to some extent with identity, but with eroticism. You cannot satisfy everyone. You can try, you can make each section, for example, LGBT equal, but still there would be complaints, like who was the curator of the exhibition? Do we have male or female nude? Not enough transgender bodies. There are always complaints because we have this vast longing, actually, for equal representations. And this is, your question shows this vast longing, this need for representation that we expect from everything, including such an archaic institutions to some extent, like museums, right?
I would certainly agree with you with that sense of longing. I mean, one thing that we said in the first panel of the exhibition was that this couldn't be a canon and that this history was incomplete. And it's incomplete, I think, in two major ways. One is the numbers of works that just haven't survived, representing an enormous range of different identities and experiences. But the other way is the artistic careers that were never allowed to flourish, the people who were never able to find their voice and for whom surviving or living or finding a way to be meant that they couldn't find creative expression. And I think it's very important to remember, particularly when in relation to a historic show, that there is that oppressive history that looms over it. Having said that, we did have some incredibly important and exciting trans stories in the show, or proto-trans, given that that term hadn't quite got currency until right at the end of the exhibition. And it was, I mean, for lots of reasons, the poster image is, for my exhibition, was Gluck, who was an artist who described themselves as Gluck, no suffix, no prefix, no quotes. Gluck was an incredibly successful artist. They had shows at the Society of Fine Arts, which were attended by members of a royal family. It was not a life in hiding. And they were the lover of Constance Spry. And the show contained several works by Gluck, including flower paintings that connected to that relationship. There was also Claude Cahun, Marlowe Moss, and a number of different lives at different points of the 100 years covered by the exhibition. It is complicated because these people do not have options for choosing an identity. They're not often able to say, you know, I am trans, or I am a butch lesbian, or I am a gay man. They don't have, those terms don't have the same currency. So it's quite hard to kind of predict what terms they might have chosen had those terms been available. But we tried to make sure that we spoke about them, about the lives in their entirety, including the complexities around gender identity. Radcliffe Hall too, for both Radcliffe Hall and Gluck, I was very careful when writing the labels, actually to just not use pronouns to describe them, because pronouns are really confusing. And I actually once gave a whole speech called The Problem of Pronouns. It's really confusing because in certain circles they use male pronouns, in certain circles they use female pronouns. It's not the case that one is the only representation of the self, but at the same time, I didn't want to preclude anyone's reading of that life in connection to their own identity and experience. And I'm well aware of the problem that, you know, if you've made a pronoun choice on a label, that is inevitably going to leave some people feeling excluded. I don't think we've got it right in museums, and I don't think we will get it right until we have more people in museums who are able to be out with a much greater range of different identities. It's an ongoing debate. I think both Pavel and my shows represent points that we'd reached in that history, but I think that I hope that in 10, 20, 50 years' time, our shows are going to look very old-fashioned, and there'll be a new way of exploring some of these issues.
Thank you. I would like to thank you, Clare Barlow and Pavel Leszkowicz, and